There is a moment in every viral interview when the internet reacts first and thinks later. One clip lands, one quote spreads, one expression freezes into a meme, and suddenly millions of people are arguing before they have even heard the full conversation. The Katt Williams appearance on Club Shay Shay became exactly that kind of moment. Within hours, the internet had already made its decision. Clips were everywhere. Quotes were pulled apart. People were either calling him brave, chaotic, brilliant, reckless, or all four at once. But what if the real story is not only what he said, but what happens after someone says it? And even more important, why does that pattern feel so familiar when you look at Dave Chappelle over the years? Before going any further, pause and ask yourself this. When someone in entertainment starts speaking without filters, why does the reaction so often shift from "listen to this person" to "something is wrong with him"? Why does honesty so often get treated like instability? And why do people become so uncomfortable the moment a public figure steps outside the script? Because that shift, that sudden change in tone, is where this entire conversation begins. The Katt Williams interview was not just another celebrity appearance. It felt more like an eruption. Williams did not walk into that conversation with the polished, carefully packaged energy that usually dominates big interviews. There was no soft landing, no obvious attempt to protect reputations, no effort to make the answers easy for the audience to digest. He spoke as if he had reached a point where silence had become more exhausting than speaking. He named names. He pointed toward power. He suggested that the entertainment world is not just built on talent and timing, but on invisible expectations, unspoken rules, and a system that rewards compliance while punishing resistance. Whether every viewer agreed with his exact wording or not, the larger message was impossible to ignore. Success in Hollywood may not always depend on what you can do, but on what you are willing to tolerate. And that is where the discomfort begins. Because let's be honest, why do so many people in entertainment avoid speaking this directly? Why do so many artists, performers, and public figures seem to circle around the truth instead of stepping into it? Is it because they have nothing to say, or because they have learned exactly what happens when they say too much? The response to Williams followed a familiar pattern. Supporters called him fearless. Critics called him bitter. Some viewers focused on his history and used it to question his credibility. Others pointed to his career and argued that someone with his level of experience might know more than people were willing to admit. Before long, the conversation was no longer just about the interview itself. It had become about his character, his reputation, and whether the person speaking could be trusted. And that raises a hard question. When a message makes people uncomfortable, do we reject the message, or do we first attack the messenger? That question matters, because this is where the connection to Dave Chappelle starts to take shape. Dave Chappelle does not enter this conversation as a guest. He enters it as a pattern. For years, Chappelle has occupied one of the strangest positions in entertainment. Beloved, feared, praised, criticized, celebrated, and scrutinized all at once. He is the kind of figure people quote constantly but rarely understand fully. He has built a career out of saying things others would not say, but he has also paid a price for refusing to stay comfortably inside the lines. His story became iconic when he walked away from Chappelle's show at the height of its success. That decision alone still fascinates people. Who leaves that kind of money? Who walks away from that level of fame? Who turns down a guaranteed path to even greater celebrity? At the time, people offered simple explanations. Burnout, stress, pressure, a need to get away. But over the years, Chappelle has described the experience in a way that suggests the issue was not just exhaustion. He has spoken about discomfort, about creative control, about boundaries, and about the strange feeling that once a person becomes highly valuable to an industry, they may also become highly managed by it. That creates another question. When someone in that position walks away, is it irrational? Or is it the first sign that they are seeing something others are still ignoring? Because that is what makes Chappelle so compelling in this discussion. He did not just speak about pressure, he made decisions that seemed to reflect it. He did not merely joke about boundaries, he acted on them. And in a world where most people chase approval until the end of their careers, stepping away from the center of the machine feels almost unthinkable. Then there is the story that often gets called the dress story, where Chappelle has described feeling pressure around a comedic scene involving cross-dressing. Different people interpret that story in different ways. Some see it as an example of an artist resisting a push that felt wrong to him. Others see it as exaggerated, symbolic, or shaped by time and retelling. But whether one treats it as literal, symbolic, or somewhere in between, the larger point remains the same. Chappelle has long presented himself as someone who noticed pressure where others might have simply seen opportunity. And maybe that is why his name keeps resurfacing whenever another comedian, actor, or entertainer pushes back against the industry in a public way. Because the real question is not whether every story is identical. The real question is whether the atmosphere around these stories is identical. In any industry where millions of dollars are on the line, how often are people truly free to say no? How often does choice still exist once contracts, expectations, image management, and public perception are all working in the background? And when someone does refuse, how often is their refusal treated as maturity versus madness? That is what makes the comparison between Williams and Chappelle so revealing. Neither man fits neatly into the polished version of celebrity that media outlets usually prefer. Both have a way of unsettling audiences who want their entertainers to remain predictable. Both seem to move with an instinct that says they would rather be misunderstood than controlled. And both have generated the kind of public reaction that says as much about the audience as it does about the performer. There is also a deeper cultural issue at work here. Comedians are supposed to tell the truth, but only in a way that does not make anyone too uncomfortable. They are encouraged to challenge norms, but only until those norms begin to look back at them. They are praised for being fearless, but only when their fearlessness can still be packaged as entertainment. Dave Chappelle has built much of his reputation by walking that line with precision. His comedy often begins with laughter, then slowly shifts into something more complicated. He talks about race, identity, celebrity, power, and public hypocrisy in a way that forces people to think after they have already laughed. That is part of his genius. But it is also part of why he remains so controversial. Once a comedian stops being merely funny and starts being interpreted as a commentator on society, every word becomes heavier. And that leads to another uncomfortable question. What happens when a comedian tells the truth so directly that the audience no longer knows whether to laugh, agree, or defend itself? This is where the public reaction becomes almost predictable. People do not just evaluate the content. They evaluate the courage behind it. They ask whether the speaker is stable, whether he is bitter, whether he is still relevant, whether he is trying to expose something real or simply trying to stay in the spotlight. In other words, once the words are too sharp, the man behind the words becomes the target. That is why Katt Williams' interview mattered so much. Not because every viewer agreed with every claim, and not because it settled every debate, but because it reopened an old fear in entertainment. What if the people closest to the machine know more about the machine than the people who profit from it? And what if speaking openly is not the beginning of a breakdown, but the beginning of a refusal? Chappelle's story keeps coming back into public conversation because it represents something that feels rare in modern entertainment, a long-term refusal that did not collapse into disappearance. Instead of a single dramatic break, his career arc is often described as something shaped by resistance itself. He did not simply have one moment where he stepped away and returned unchanged. He built a reputation across years of tension, decisions, and recalibration, which is why he is still analyzed as one of the most complicated figures of his generation. But why does that matter so much to audiences who may never step onto a stage or sign a media contract? Perhaps because survival after resistance is not just a celebrity story. It becomes a symbolic test case. If someone walks away from a system at the peak of visibility, what is supposed to happen next? Should they fade out quietly? Should they be punished by irrelevance? Or is there a third outcome, one where they return, changed but intact, still speaking on their own terms? That possibility alone disrupts the expectations people are trained to accept. Because in most industries built on attention, there is an unspoken rule: participation requires compliance. Not always explicit, not always written down, but present in how opportunities flow, how narratives are shaped, and how reputations are maintained. So when someone like Chappelle is framed as stepping outside that structure, the reaction is not just curiosity. It becomes a kind of stress test for the system itself. And that raises a deeper question. What does it actually cost to refuse participation at that level? Is it just lost opportunities and temporary backlash, or something more subtle, like having your entire public identity rewritten while you are gone? Because when a public figure steps away, the story does not stop. It continues without them. And when they return, they are often walking back into a version of themselves they did not personally authorize. That is part of why people keep linking Chappelle's trajectory to other outspoken figures like Katt Williams. It is not about claiming they are the same person or even operating in the same way. It is about how audiences interpret moments of disruption. Both figures, in different ways, have become symbols placed at the edge of a familiar cultural question. What happens when someone inside a highly managed industry begins speaking in a way that feels unmanaged? Do we listen more carefully, or do we become more suspicious? Because the uncomfortable truth is that visibility does not guarantee understanding. In fact, the more visible someone becomes, the more layered the interpretations around them tend to get. Every statement becomes filtered through prior narratives, industry assumptions, and audience expectations. So sometimes the real question is not what was said, but what people were already prepared to hear. That is why Chappelle is often seen as a long-game example. His career is not just about comedy specials or public appearances. It is about how resistance itself becomes part of a public identity over time. He did not only step back, he also returned in a way that kept control of pacing, messaging, and exposure. And that return is often studied almost like a case study in narrative control. But control is never simple in the public eye. Because even when someone carefully manages their re-entry, interpretation still belongs to the audience. So what does it mean to control your narrative if you cannot fully control how it is received? That question sits underneath much of this discussion. Meanwhile, Katt Williams' moment in the spotlight created a different kind of public reaction. What made his approach so striking was not only what he said, but how little distance he placed between thought and expression. There was less cushioning, fewer layers of comedic deflection, and a tone that felt more like direct confrontation than performance. And that difference matters more than people often admit. Because comedy traditionally creates a safe corridor for difficult ideas. It allows truth to pass through humor, making it easier to receive and harder to immediately reject. But when that corridor is removed, when the message is delivered without the usual protective framing, the audience is forced into a more binary position. Agree or reject. Trust or doubt. Accept or resist. So here is a question that becomes unavoidable in that context. Do audiences react more strongly to what is said, or to the vulnerability of the person saying it without filters? Because unfiltered speech changes the emotional weight of a statement. It removes the escape hatch of, "it was just a joke," and replaces it with something that demands immediate interpretation. And interpretation, especially in public discourse, is rarely neutral. This is where patterns begin to emerge in how people talk about fame and truth-telling in entertainment. Some observers describe a recurring cycle. A performer rises, gains leverage, begins speaking more freely, and then finds themselves under increased scrutiny. The scrutiny may focus on credibility, tone, timing, or intent, but the effect is often the same. Public perception becomes more unstable. Is that simply the natural result of visibility? Or is it something more structural about how attention behaves when it becomes concentrated? Because attention is not just observation. It is pressure. And under pressure, even simple statements can become distorted into larger narratives. So another question appears. When someone becomes controversial, do we continue evaluating their words on their own terms, or do we begin evaluating them through the controversy first? Once that shift happens, it becomes difficult to reverse. Even silence, which might seem like absence, becomes meaningful in that environment. After Katt Williams' viral moment, part of what kept the conversation alive was not continuous explanation, but the lack of it. He did not transform the moment into an endless media circuit. He did not immediately over-clarify or repeatedly reframe his statements. And that absence of follow-up became its own subject of interpretation. Because in an attention-driven environment, silence is never just silence. It becomes a signal. So then the question becomes, when someone stops speaking after a major public moment, is that an act of control or a form of retreat from escalation? And who gets to decide the difference? Dave Chappelle's path adds another layer to this discussion because his return to the public stage was not random or reactive. It was structured, deliberate, and shaped by clear boundaries. Limited interviews, carefully chosen appearances, and stand-up performances that often included commentary on fame itself all contributed to a controlled re-engagement with the public. But even that control exists alongside interpretation he does not fully own. Because audiences do not just watch performances, they build narratives around them. So when Chappelle speaks about boundaries, misunderstanding, or the cost of visibility, it feeds into a larger ongoing debate about what it means to exist inside an industry that depends on being seen while constantly reshaping how being seen is interpreted. Which brings everything back to a central tension. Returning is not the same as resuming. A return implies change has occurred. So another question emerges naturally. When someone re-enters a system after stepping away from it, are they continuing their original path, or adapting to a new version of that system they now understand differently? And if adaptation happens, does it represent growth, compromise, strategy, or survival? At this point, the conversation is no longer just about two comedians or two public moments. It becomes a broader examination of how power, perception, and communication interact in spaces where visibility is currency. Because whether someone is framed as outspoken, cautious, controversial, or misunderstood, the underlying reality remains consistent. Speaking in public comes with consequences that extend far beyond the moment of speech itself. Those consequences shape timing. They shape tone. They shape silence. They even shape how future statements will be interpreted before they are fully heard. So we arrive at a final set of questions that cannot be answered with certainty, only considered with awareness. When people in high-visibility industries speak more directly, are we hearing unfiltered truth or increased risk? When they speak more carefully, are we seeing wisdom or constraint? And when they step away entirely, are we witnessing freedom or displacement from the conversation? Because in the end, the pattern being discussed is not just about individuals reacting to fame. It is about how any system built on attention responds when the people inside it begin to challenge the terms of how that attention is used. So the final question remains open. Are we watching individuals break away from a system that cannot contain them? Or individuals learning, over time, how to survive inside it without being fully defined by it? And when the next controversial voice appears, loud, quiet, direct, or carefully measured, what will the audience prioritize first? The message being spoken, or the cost required to speak it at all?